In 1996, white boxer Andrew Galota relentlessly punched Riddick Bowe straight in the groin. The referee saw it but deliberately ignored it to save the television broadcast. When Bowe's corner jumped in to retaliate, the American media machine instantly flipped the script. The press whitewashed Galota into a victim with psychological issues. In contrast, they branded Bowe's team as wild animals and black thugs. The white fighter who fought dirty was pitied, while the black fighter who was assaulted was turned into a criminal. This racist media system used their pens to execute a champion. Riddick Lamont Bowe was born on August 10, 1967. He was the 12th of 13 children. His mother, Dorothy, was the sole provider, working relentless shifts just to keep the basic utilities running in a severely overcrowded apartment in Brownsville, Brooklyn. There was no father in the picture. There was no safety net. From the moment he could comprehend his surroundings, Bowe understood that he was a statistical anomaly simply by surviving. Death was not an abstract concept in the Bowe household. It was a physical presence. The family sustained heavy direct casualties. Bowe's older brother, Henry, contracted HIV and died a slow, deteriorating death from AIDS. Shortly after, his sister, Brenda, was stabbed to death on the street during a mugging. There was no time for psychological counseling. There was no space for grief. In a household of 13 children operating below the poverty line, mourning was a luxury they could not afford. You buried the dead and you went back to work. This established the psychological baseline for Riddick Bowe: hypervigilance, emotional detachment, and the normalization of extreme violence. He did not walk into the Bedford-Stuyvesant Boxing Association gym to find a father figure or to build character. He walked in to acquire the physical tools necessary to avoid becoming the third casualty in his family. Boxing was a strictly utilitarian pursuit. It was the acquisition of armor. Physically, Bowe was an anomaly. He grew to 6 feet, 5 inches tall, carrying a massive 82-inch reach. In the standard mechanics of boxing, a fighter with those dimensions is trained to fight on the outside. They are taught to use the jab to maintain distance, keeping opponents at the end of their punches to avoid taking damage. Bowe rejected this entirely. He fought like a man trapped in a phone booth. He smothered his opponents, stepping inside their guard to deliver devastating uppercuts and brutal hooks to the body. This was not a tactical flaw. It was a psychological revelation. Bowe's fighting style was a direct reflection of his survival mechanism. He did not retreat. He did not create distance. He engaged the threat at point-blank range and neutralized it before it could hurt him. His amateur career was a violent, highly efficient operation. He was a wrecking machine tearing through the local and national circuits. Between 1985 and 1988, Bowe captured 4 New York Golden Gloves championships. He accumulated an amateur record of 104 wins against only 18 losses. He sparred with professionals, absorbing heavy shots and returning fire with terrifying power. He was not a polished, corporate-friendly athlete. He was a raw, highly effective weapon built by his environment. By 1988, at 21 years old, that weapon was deployed to Seoul, South Korea, to represent the United States at the Olympic Games. The Olympics are sold as a pure athletic meritocracy. The reality is that amateur boxing at the Olympic level is a heavily politicized, administratively controlled machine. Bowe battered his way through the preliminary rounds of the super heavyweight division. He secured his place in the gold medal match against a towering Canadian representative named Lennox Lewis. Bowe was the favorite. He had the power, the inside game, and the momentum. But the outcome of the gold medal match was not determined by the fighters. It was dictated by the referee, Pablo Sarmiento of East Germany. The mechanics of the robbery were systematic. In the first round, Sarmiento constantly interfered, breaking the fighters apart the moment Bowe stepped inside to utilize his primary weapon in fighting. Sarmiento neutralized Bowe's tactical advantage. In the second round, Sarmiento issued a highly questionable standing 8 count against Bowe after a glancing, inconsequential blow. Moments later, Sarmiento penalized Bowe for an alleged headbutt, deducting a crucial point on the scorecards. Bowe's momentum was intentionally stalled. He was fighting 2 opponents, Lewis and the official. Later in the second round, Lewis landed a solid right hand. Bowe stumbled, but he immediately regained his balance. He remained on his feet. His eyes were clear. He was entirely capable of continuing the fight. Sarmiento did not administer a count. He immediately waved his arms, stopping the fight and awarding Lewis the gold medal by technical knockout. It was a premature, heavily biased stoppage that robbed a 21-year-old fighter of an Olympic gold medal on the world stage. The physical defeat, however, was secondary to the psychological destruction that followed the next morning. The American sports media apparatus did not investigate the atrocious officiating. They did not question the political biases of the Amateur Boxing Association or interview the referee. Instead, the predominantly white media establishment aimed their crosshairs directly at Bowe's character. Major publications and television commentators immediately branded Bowe with the most damaging stereotypes available. They called him lazy. They labeled him a quitter. They questioned his heart, his courage, and his work ethic. They completely bypassed the factual reality of the premature stoppage and constructed a narrative of moral failure. This is the exact mechanism of structural bias in the sports industry. When a white athlete lost under controversial circumstances, the media analyzed the rules, scrutinized the officials, and framed the athlete as a victim of bad luck. But when a black athlete from a decimated neighborhood lost under the exact same circumstances, the failure was instantly and universally attributed to a deep-seated flaw in his character. The media stripped Bowe of his entire context. They ignored the kid who survived severe poverty, the kid who buried his murdered sister, the kid who fought his way to the Olympic finals. They reduced him to a one-dimensional, easily digestible caricature, the undisciplined, lazy black heavyweight. Bowe returned to the United States with a silver medal and a highly damaged reputation. The industry had established its dominance. They had proven they possessed the power to control the narrative, alter reality, and assassinate a fighter's character without facing a single consequence. Bowe was no longer an Olympic hero. He was marked discounted merchandise. He was viewed not as a human being who had been robbed of his achievement, but as a flawed asset. He was vulnerable. The power vacuum left by his departure from the amateur ranks was wide open, and the men waiting to control his professional career knew exactly how to exploit a fighter whom the public had already been conditioned to hate. The silver medal from Seoul did not come with corporate endorsements. It came with a target on his back. When Riddick Bowe returned to the United States in 1988, he was a highly stigmatized commodity. The media had successfully branded him a quitter. In the ruthless economy of professional boxing, a damaged reputation is a promoter's greatest asset. It provides the leverage necessary to lowball a fighter, strip them of negotiation power, and lock them into predatory long-term contracts. Bowe was standing at the edge of the professional ranks with zero financial literacy, no legal representation, and no father figure to shield him from the incoming predators. The power vacuum was absolute. Professional boxing is not a sport. It is an unregulated casino operating under the guise of athletic competition. The fighters are the chips. The promoters are the house. And the house always dictates the terms. Bowe needed a manager, someone to navigate the complex infrastructure of sanctioning bodies, television networks, and hostile negotiations. What he got was Rock Newman. Rock Newman was not a traditional boxing man. He did not come from the gyms. He was a former radio host, a political operative, and a highly charismatic talker operating out of Washington, D.C. Newman possessed a terrifyingly sharp understanding of racial politics, media manipulation, and financial exploitation. He looked at Riddick Bowe and did not see a vulnerable 21-year-old trauma survivor. He saw a heavily armed physical vessel that could be weaponized to print millions of dollars. Newman's first operational objective was standard cult protocol, isolation. He removed Bowe from his familiar surroundings in Brooklyn and relocated his training camp to the Washington, D.C. area. He severed Bowe's ties with potential outside advisors. Newman installed himself not just as a manager, but as the absolute authority in Bowe's life. He became the accountant, the spokesperson, the surrogate father, and the dictator. To legitimize the operation, Newman made one strategically brilliant move. He hired the legendary Eddie Futch to be Bowe's head trainer. Futch was a master tactician, a man who had trained Joe Frazier and possessed unimpeachable credibility. Futch was brought in to do one job: turn Bowe's raw, street-level aggression into refined championship-caliber violence. Futch controlled the ring. He taught Bowe how to weaponize his massive frame, how to set up the uppercut, and how to systematically dismantle heavyweights. But Futch's authority stopped at the ropes. He did not control the boardroom. He did not oversee the bank accounts. While Futch was building an unstoppable physical machine in the gym, Newman was constructing a financial trap in the office. By November 1992, the machine was fully operational. Bowe faced the undefeated, undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, Evander Holyfield. This was the moment the investment had to pay off. The fight was a brutal, physically destructive transaction. In the legendary 10th round, Bowe absorbed catastrophic damage, weathering a barrage of punches from Holyfield before unleashing a devastating counter-assault. Bowe bled, took severe head trauma, and pushed his body to the absolute brink of failure to win a unanimous decision. He captured the WBA, WBC, and IBF belts. He was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. The physical asset had peaked. Now Newman had to protect the revenue stream. Immediately after winning the title, the WBC mandated that Bowe must defend his belt against the number one contender, Lennox Lewis. This was the same Lennox Lewis who had defeated Bowe at the 1988 Olympics. From a competitive standpoint, it was the only fight that mattered. From a business standpoint, Rock Newman saw an unacceptable risk. If Bowe fought Lewis and lost, the undisputed championship, the ultimate bargaining chip for pay-per-view networks, would vanish. Newman's cash cow would be slaughtered. Newman refused to let the fight happen, but he could not simply decline the contract. That would look weak. He needed a spectacle. He needed to manipulate the media to frame the evasion as a dominant, rebellious act. On December 14, 1992, Newman orchestrated one of the most cynical PR stunts in boxing history. He organized a press conference in London. In front of a swarm of international journalists, Bowe was instructed to approach a garbage can and physically dump the WBC championship belt into the trash. Newman fed Bowe the talking points. The narrative was that the WBC was corrupt, that they were demanding unreasonable terms, and that Bowe was standing up against systemic injustice. It was a complete fabrication. It was a calculated business maneuver designed to dodge a dangerous opponent and keep Bowe's earning potential in-house. But the execution of the stunt achieved exactly what Newman wanted, at the direct expense of Bowe's humanity. The media fallout was instantaneous and venomous. The press did not analyze Rock Newman's contractual motives. They aimed their fire entirely at Bowe. They framed the trash can incident as the ultimate act of disrespect to the sport of boxing. Bowe was universally branded as a coward, an arrogant thug, and a disgrace to the heavyweight lineage. Newman utilized a tactic known as inappropriate blackness. He intentionally leaned into aggressive militant aesthetics, frequently aligning Bowe's public image with the Nation of Islam and presenting the camp as a hostile anti-establishment force. Newman knew that a controversial, highly scrutinized black heavyweight generated massive pay-per-view numbers from a white audience eager to see him lose. He commodified racial tension. The trap was now fully locked. Rock Newman pulled the strings, dictated the opponents, and orchestrated the controversies. He operated entirely in the shadows, insulated from public backlash. Riddick Bowe, the man taking the actual concussions, absorbed 100% of the media's hatred and the public's racial animosity. Bowe was the undisputed champion of the world, but he owned absolutely nothing. He was a captive asset, executing orders, taking the physical damage, and standing squarely in the line of fire, while his manager quietly counted the untaxed millions behind closed doors. To understand the destruction of Riddick Bowe, you must first dismantle the illusion of heavyweight wealth. The public sees the pay-per-view numbers. They see the Las Vegas marquees, the customized Rolls Royces, and the $10 million checks held up for the cameras. This is a deliberate fabrication. In the 1990s boxing economy, the number printed on a fighter's contract was not a guarantee of income. It was a gross valuation of the human asset. Between the gross valuation and the fighter's actual bank account stood a labyrinth of managers, promoters, sanctioning bodies, lawyers, and tax traps. Bowe was not the beneficiary of his own violence. He was the host organism for a sprawling parasitic corporate structure. The tragedy of this financial extraction is magnified by the actual psychological profile of the fighter. The sports media spent years meticulously crafting Bowe into an arrogant, uncontrollable brute. The factual reality of his actions presented a completely different human being. Bowe possessed a deep inherent empathy born from his survival in Brownsville. He understood the mechanics of suffering. In early 1993, while at the absolute peak of his global fame and earning power, Bowe executed an operation that defied every stereotype the media had built around him. A brutal civil war and devastating famine were ravaging Somalia. The United Nations and the U.S. military were conducting Operation Restore Hope. Bowe did not simply issue a press release or write a tax-deductible check from a heavily guarded mansion. He spent $100,000 of his own money on critical medical supplies, boarded a military cargo plane, and flew directly into Mogadishu. He landed in an active war zone. He personally unloaded boxes of medicine and distributed them to starving refugees and overwhelmed medical workers. He walked through refugee camps surrounded by armed militia. He put his physical safety at risk for people who offered absolutely zero return on investment. Shortly after, another incident highlighted this radical empathy. Halfway across the world in the Philippines, a young man was electrocuted to death. He had climbed onto a roof in a desperate attempt to adjust a television antenna so he could watch Bowe fight on a pirated broadcast. When the news reached Bowe, he did not ignore it. He tracked down the impoverished family. He quietly provided them sibais, massive financial support, effectively ensuring their survival in the wake of the tragedy. These were not the actions of the monstrous thug portrayed on the covers of sports magazines. These were the actions of a man who recognized the stench of poverty and felt a moral obligation to alleviate it. But in the ruthless calculus of professional boxing, empathy is not a virtue. It is a vulnerability. Rock Newman and his managerial syndicate viewed Bowe's charitable instincts with cold, clinical detachment. They recognized that a man willing to give away hundreds of thousands of dollars to strangers in a war zone was a man who was not paying close attention to the accounting books. Newman capitalized on Bowe's lack of financial literacy. He constructed a predatory financial architecture designed to legally siphon the wealth generated by Bowe's physical trauma. The mechanics of this white-collar extortion were brilliant in their brutality. In a standard managerial contract, the manager takes a percentage of the fighter's purse, typically between 20 and 33%. But Newman manipulated the structure. The contracts were drawn so that Newman and his associates took their massive cuts directly from the gross revenue. Before a single tax form was filed, before the training camp was paid, and before the sanctioning fees were deducted, Newman secured his untaxed millions and transferred them offshore or into heavily protected corporate entities. The devastation fell entirely on the fighter. By structuring the corporate entities this way, Bowe was established as the sole independent contractor, effectively making him the legal employer of the entire operation. Bowe was forced to carry the tax liability for the gross amount. If a fight generated $10 million, Newman and his camp extracted their $3.3 million immediately. Bowe was left with $6.7 million, but the Internal Revenue Service taxed him on the initial $10 million. When federal, state, and local taxes were applied, add to the gross sum, Bowe's tax bill routinely exceeded $4.5 million. The bleeding did not stop there. The cost of doing business in the heavyweight division is astronomical. Sanctioning bodies like the WBA, WBC, and IBF demand flat percentages, often up to 3% of the total purse each, just for the privilege of fighting for their heavily manufactured belts. Then came the training camp expenses. Newman bloated Bowe's entourage with highly paid advisors, security personnel, and cronies, whose primary job was to maintain Newman's control over the fighter. The salaries, the luxury travel, the hotels, and the lavish training facilities in places like the Mirage in Las Vegas were not covered by the promoter. They were deducted directly from Bowe's rapidly shrinking net income. When the blood was finally wiped from the canvas and the ledgers were closed, the heavyweight champion of the world, the man who absorbed the concussions, the broken ribs, and the permanent neurological damage, walked away with a fraction of the wealth he generated. He was bleeding out financially, but the hemorrhage was entirely legal. The media was fully complicit in this silent robbery. The elite boxing press corps of the 1990s, men who sat ringside, attended. The public perception of a heavyweight champion in the 1990s was built on the illusion of limitless wealth. It was the era of the premium cable mega deal, when Riddick Bowe signed a multi-fight contract with HBO and Time Warner, a deal aggressively publicized as being worth upwards of $100 million. The media painted a picture of a man drowning in cash. They showed the luxury cars, the massive estates, and the massive entourages. It was a carefully constructed facade. Behind the flashing cameras and the theatrical press conferences, a highly sophisticated, entirely legal financial shakedown was actively dismantling Bowe's future. A standard managerial cut in professional boxing hovers around 20 to 33%. But Newman did not operate as a standard manager. He positioned himself as an all-encompassing governing body. Newman controlled the promotional entity. He negotiated the site fees. He dictated the international television rights. By controlling the entire apparatus, Newman structured the revenue streams so that his cut came off the gross total, completely untouched by the underlying expenses. The trap was executed in the tax structuring. If Bowe's gross purse was $10 million, the Internal Revenue Service assessed Bowe's tax liability based on that full $10 million figure. However, Bowe never saw the gross. Rock Newman immediately extracted his massive percentage. Then came the training camp expenses. Bowe was billed for everything. He paid the salaries of legendary trainer Eddie Futch and the assistant coaches. He paid for the sparring partners, their housing, and their medical bills. He paid for the extravagant security details and the travel logistics that Newman demanded to maintain their anti-establishment, militant public image. After the management cuts, the sanctioning fees to the WBA, IBF, and WBO, and the exorbitant camp expenses were deducted, Bowe was left with a fraction of the original purse. But the IRS did not care about Rock Newman's cut. They cared about the gross. Bowe was forced to pay the tax burden for the entire $10 million out of his depleted net earnings. If his net take-home was $3 million and his tax bill was $4 million, the champion of the world was effectively losing money every time he stepped into the ring. Newman and his associates walked away with millions in untaxed clean capital. Bowe was left holding a massive tax deficit. The management was not just taking his money, they were actively pushing him into federal debt. This financial bleeding was heavily disguised by Bowe's genuine private humanity. The media, fed by Newman's controversial marketing tactics, relentlessly portrayed Bowe as a street thug. They amplified his trash talk and highlighted every public altercation. They entirely ignored the fact that Riddick Bowe, stripped of his boxing persona, possessed a deeply empathetic core that made him highly vulnerable to financial predators. Rock Newman recognized that a fighter so willing to distribute his wealth to strangers in war zones and impoverished families in the Philippines was a man not strictly auditing his own ledgers. Bowe's radical empathy was a virtue to the world, but to his management, it was a gaping vulnerability. He was bleeding capital from two arteries, his unguarded generosity and his manager's calculated extraction. Months later, a tragic incident occurred in the Philippines. A young man was electrocuted and killed while attempting to climb a roof to adjust an antenna so he could watch a broadcast of Bowe's fight. When Bowe heard the news, he did not issue a standard press release of condolences. He tracked down the family and quietly provided them with significant financial support to cover funeral expenses and ease their burden. These were not the actions of the arrogant, selfish monster the media had constructed. These were the actions of a man who remembered exactly what it felt like to be impoverished, hungry, and ignored by the system. But in the ruthless ecosystem of professional boxing, extreme generosity is a fatal weakness. Rock Newman recognized this immediately. Bowe's willingness to give his money away meant he was not strictly auditing where the rest of his money was going. Bowe trusted his manager to handle the ledgers while he focused on the violence in the ring and his charity outside of it. He was bleeding capital from two arteries, his own unguarded generosity and his manager's calculated extraction. By the time Bowe engaged in his legendary trilogy with Evander Holyfield, losing the belts in a grueling, exhausted performance in 1993, and then reclaiming his dominance by knocking Holyfield out in 1995, the financial pressure had fundamentally altered his career trajectory. He was no longer fighting to build a legacy. He was fighting to service a massive hidden debt. The physical toll of this trap was immediate. To keep up with the tax liabilities and the exorbitant costs of Newman's operation, Bowe had to fight frequently. He could not afford long recoveries. He could not afford to take time off to let his brain heal from the massive concussions he absorbed in the Holyfield Wars. The system required a constant flow of fresh capital. This is the cold reality of the boxing cartel. When a fighter is financially secure, they can dictate their terms. They can choose when to fight, who to fight, and when to rest. When a fighter is buried in manufactured debt, they lose their autonomy. They become an indentured asset. Newman needed Bowe back in the ring as quickly as possible to generate the next round of management fees. The media looked at Bowe's massive frame and criticized his fluctuating weight, calling him undisciplined between camps. They completely missed the fact that Bowe was psychologically exhausted, trapped on a treadmill he could not turn off. He was eating to cope with the immense stress of a financial empire that was collapsing directly on his shoulders, all while his manager continued to sign the contracts that would send him back into the meat grinder. The stage was set. Bowe was physically compromised from the Holyfield Wars, mentally exhausted, and financially hollowed out. The management needed a highly profitable, seemingly easy fight to keep the cash flowing. They looked across the heavyweight landscape and found a Polish fighter named Andrew Golota. It was supposed to be a routine payday. It turned into a systematic physical destruction that the sport would never forget. July 11th, 1996, Madison Square Garden. This was not a championship bout. It was a scheduled extraction. Riddick Bowe stepped into the ring, weighing a sluggish 252 pounds. He was physically eroded from his wars with Evander Holyfield and mentally hollowed out by the relentless financial demands of his management. Rock Newman needed a high-margin, low-risk payday to feed the corporate machine. The opponent selected for this transaction was Andrew Golota, an undefeated but largely untested Polish heavyweight. Golota was brought in to lose. He was supposed to be a heavy bag with a pulse, a stepping stone to keep Bowe active while HBO negotiated the next mega fight. The cartel miscalculated. The fight did not deliver a routine victory. It delivered a public execution of the sport's remaining integrity. From the opening bell, Bowe was dangerously slow. His legendary infighting reflexes were gone. Golota, utilizing a stiff jab and superior conditioning, easily outboxed the former undisputed champion. But outboxing Bowe was not enough for Golota. As the fight progressed, a sinister and deliberate strategy emerged. Golota began targeting Bowe's groin. These were not accidental, glancing blows caused by a shifting target. These were intentional full-leverage uppercuts delivered directly into Bowe's testicles. In the third round, Golota landed the first severe low blow. Referee Wayne Kelly issued a warning. In the fourth round, Golota struck the groin again. Kelly deducted a point. In the sixth round, Golota drove another vicious uppercut below the belt line. Bowe dropped to the canvas, writhing in sheer physiological agony. Kelly deducted another point, but demanded Bowe continue. This is the exact point where the institutional negligence of professional boxing is exposed. The referee is the sole authority in the ring, explicitly mandated to protect the physical safety of the fighters. Wayne Kelly watched a 240-pound heavyweight repeatedly and intentionally inflict catastrophic illegal trauma upon a compromised opponent. Instead of disqualifying Golota and protecting the victim, the official system demanded that Bowe stand up and continue absorbing the abuse. The promoters, the network executives sitting ringside, and the athletic commists, Ion all remained silent. Stopping the fight meant ruining the broadcast. The money demanded that the violence continue. In the 7th round, Golota launched a final devastating combination. He trapped Bowe against the ropes and buried a left uppercut deep into Bowe's groin. It was a career-ending foul. Bowe collapsed to the canvas, completely incapacitated. Kelly finally disqualified Golota. What followed was one of the most violent riots in American sports history. Rock Newman and Bowe's heavily armed entourage did not wait for the athletic commission to restore order. They vaulted the ropes and stormed the ring. They recognized what the referee and the media refused to acknowledge. Golota had just committed aggravated assault under the guise of a boxing match. The ring instantly transformed into an unregulated crime scene. Members of Bowe's camp swarmed Golota. One associate, wielding a heavy Motorola walkie-talkie, smashed it directly into Golota's skull, opening a massive laceration that would require 11 stitches. In the ensuing chaos, Golota's 74-year-old trainer, Lou Duva, collapsed to the canvas, suffering an apparent heart event, and had to be carried out on a stretcher. Fights broke out in the stands. The Madison Square Garden floor became a war zone. The riot was terrifying, but the real brutality occurred the following morning. When the sun came up, the American sports media apparatus activated its racial double standard. The white press corps had an objective set of facts. Andrew Golota had repeatedly and intentionally utilized illegal, damaging strikes to cripple an opponent. Riddick Bowe was the victim of this sustained assault, but that narrative did not serve the racial biases of the 1990s media market. The media executed a complete systemic whitewashing of Andrew Golota. Major newspapers and high-profile commentators framed Golota's dirty tactics as a psychological quirk. They called it a mental block, an anxiety issue, and a tragic flaw. They analyzed Golota with clinical sympathy, turning the perpetrator of a prolonged physical assault into a misunderstood victim of his own mind. Simultaneously, the media weaponized the riot against Bowe. The headlines did not focus on the agonizing, illegal blows Bowe endured. They focused entirely on the post-fight violence. Bowe and his corner were universally branded as animals, thugs, and a disgrace to civilized society. The media used the chaotic reaction to the assault to validate their pre-existing racist narratives about Bowe. The system successfully criminalized the black fighter for the reaction of his camp while completely absolving the white fighter who initiated the illegal violence. The logical, ethical response to the Madison Square Garden riot would have been severe suspensions, medical evaluations, and a lengthy ban for Golota. But ethics do not generate pay-per-view revenue. The controversy generated astronomical mainstream attention. The HBO executives, the casino operators, and Rock Newman looked at the blood on the canvas and saw dollar signs. They did not see two fighters who needed medical and psychological intervention. They saw a highly marketable grudge match. Driven by sheer, unadulterated greed, the cartel forced a rematch. They booked Bowe versus Golota 2 for December 14, 1996 in Atlantic City. This decision was a medical death sentence for Riddick Bowe. He was given less than 5 months to recover from severe physical trauma, drop the excess weight, and enter another brutal training camp. The human brain requires extensive downtime to heal from concussive damage. The neurochemistry needs to reset. Bowe was granted no such luxury. He was shoved directly back into the meat grinder to capitalize on the media frenzy. The rematch was a masterclass in physical destruction. Galata, fueled by the media's sympathetic treatment, fought with terrifying precision. In the second round, Galata dropped Bowe with a brutal combination. Bowe survived, relying entirely on raw instinct. In the fourth round, Bowe rallied, dropping Galata, but in the fifth round, the nightmare repeated itself. Galata reverted to his illegal tactics, unleashing a deliberate headbutt and a massive low blow. By the late rounds, the fight descended into pure slaughter. Bowe was absorbing catastrophic head trauma. In the ninth round, Galata unleashed a flurry of punches that snapped Bowe's head back repeatedly. The sheer kinetic force of a 240-pound heavyweight landing flush on the human jaw causes the brain to violently accelerate and decelerate, crashing against the interior of the skull. Neurons tear, blood vessels rupture. This is the exact mechanical origin of chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Despite dominating the fight, Galata's psychological instability surfaced again. At the end of the ninth round, he deliberately fired another devastating combination directly into Bowe's groin. Bowe collapsed in a heap of agony. For the second time in 5 months, Galata was disqualified for intentional low blows. Riddick Bowe won the fight on paper. In reality, he lost everything. When Bowe sat in the locker room in Atlantic City that night, the cognitive destruction was already permanent. The two fights with Galata did not just end his career, they effectively ended his neurological functionality. His speech, once sharp and charismatic, became noticeably slurred. His response times lagged. His physical coordination began to disintegrate. The signs of severe traumatic brain injury were glaringly obvious to anyone standing in the room. But the medical commissions looked the other way. The state-appointed doctors, whose sole job was to protect the fighters, signed off on the paperwork and disappeared. The sports journalists, who built their careers documenting Bowe's rise, now mocked his deteriorated state. They wrote cynical columns about his weight gain and his slow, plodding demeanor. They treated his neurological decay as a punchline. Nobody intervened. Rock Newman collected his massive percentage of the gross revenue. The television networks secured their ratings. The casinos kept the gambling money. The system extracted the absolute final drops of capital from Riddick Bowe's skull, packed up the ring, and left him alone with a shattered brain. When the final bell rings and a fighter is no longer capable of generating millions of dollars, the boxing cartel executes a very specific protocol: absolute abandonment. There is no retirement package. There is no long-term medical care. The promoters, the sycophants, and the television executives simply stop answering the phone. By early 1997, Riddick Bowe was isolated in a silent house. The roaring crowds of Madison Square Garden were gone, replaced by a terrifying, creeping silence in his own mind. The two Galata fights had fundamentally rewired Bowe's neurology. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy is not a simple headache. It is the physical rotting of the brain's frontal lobe, the exact area responsible for executive function, emotional regulation, and impulse control. When you systematically destroy a man's frontal lobe with repeated massive kinetic impacts, you strip away his grip on reality. Paranoia replaces logic. Aggression replaces restraint. Bowe was rapidly losing control of his faculties, and he knew it. In a desperate, irrational attempt to find structure and discipline, the former heavyweight champion of the world drove to a military recruiting office. In January 1997, Bowe enlisted in the United States Marine Corps Reserve. It was a staggering display of cognitive dissonance. A 30-year-old man with severe untreated brain trauma and a deteriorating physical frame genuinely believed he could survive the rigors of Parris Island boot camp. The military experiment lasted exactly 3 days. Bowe quit. He could not process the commands. He could not handle the physical output. His brain and body were entirely disconnected. This was a massive blinking red light. It was a clear, undeniable medical emergency. A man who previously possessed the superhuman discipline to fight 36 professional bouts could not last 72 hours in basic training. The appropriate response from the sports community would have been urgent medical intervention. Instead, the American media machine treated it as a comedy sketch. The journalists who had built their careers profiting off his blood now wrote mocking columns about his failure in the military. They laughed at the overweight, confused ex-champion, completely ignoring the fact that his brain was literally shutting down from the damage their industry had demanded of him. Without the structure of boxing and failing to find a substitute in the military, Bowe's descent into severe paranoia accelerated. The ultimate manifestation of this untreated brain trauma exploded into public view in February 1998. Bowe's marriage to his estranged wife, Judy, had collapsed under the weight of his erratic behavior. She had taken their 5 children and moved to Cornelius, North Carolina. Bowe's destroyed frontal lobe concocted a delusional, terrifying solution to reunite his family. This was no longer a sports story. It was a true crime incident born directly from sports-induced brain damage. Bowe drove from Maryland to North Carolina. He was armed with a tactical arsenal, a knife, handcuffs, pepper spray, and rolls of duct tape. He ambushed his wife at her home. He forced her and the 5 children into his vehicle. During the ensuing chaos and the forced drive spanning multiple state lines, Bowe's erratic aggression peaked and he stabbed his wife in the chest. It was a chaotic, horrific kidnapping that ended only when police intercepted the vehicle in Virginia. The crime was undeniable. Bowe was arrested and faced federal kidnapping charges. When the case went to court, the full hypocrisy of the American legal and media systems was put on display. The media establishment finally had the narrative they had been trying to build since 1988. They flooded the news cycle with articles validating their old racist stereotypes. They gleefully reported that the thug had finally shown his true colors. They framed the kidnapping entirely as an act of inherent criminal malice. They completely erased the context. The defense team brought in top neurologists who presented undeniable medical evidence. Bowe's brain was severely, permanently damaged. Scans proved the massive deterioration of his frontal lobe. The doctors testified that the kidnapping was not a calculated criminal enterprise, but the direct erratic result of severe CTE. Bowe lacked the neurological capacity to form rational intent. The system did not care. Acknowledging that boxing caused the violent psychosis would mean indicting the entire multi-billion-dollar sports industry. It would mean acknowledging that the networks, the promoters, and the athletic commissions were complicit in manufacturing a violent criminal. The court opted to protect the industry. Bowe was convicted and ultimately sentenced to 17 months in federal prison. The establishment locked the broken toy in a cage and threw away the key. But the true horror of Bowe's downfall was not confined to a federal cell. The most vicious betrayal happened in the shadows, executed by the man who had architected his entire career. While Bowe was losing his mind and facing federal prosecution, his manager, Rock Newman, quietly initiated his exit strategy. Newman liquidated his involvement. He packed up his untaxed millions, the wealth extracted directly from Bowe's blood and concussions, and vanished from the Bowe family's life. Newman left his fighter absolutely defenseless against the IRS, the legal system, and bankruptcy. The financial abandonment was ruthless, but it was overshadowed by a betrayal so grotesque it defies comprehension. As the dust settled on the wreckage of Bowe's life, devastating allegations emerged from within the innermost circle. Close family associates revealed that Rock Newman had crossed the ultimate line. While manipulating Bowe's career and finances, Newman allegedly used his absolute authority and proximity to engage in an inappropriate, predatory relationship with Bowe's own teenage daughter. This was the final, lethal strike. Newman did not just rob Riddick Bowe of his wealth. He did not just push him into the physical trauma that destroyed his brain. Newman systematically dismantled the man's sanctuary. He infiltrated the home, exploited the offspring, and extracted every conceivable drop of value, financial, physical, and psychological, before walking away without a single legal consequence. Riddick Bowe sat in a federal penitentiary. His brain was irreparably damaged. His bank accounts were drained. His wife was traumatized. His family unit was desecrated by his own manager. The boxing cartel had successfully processed its raw material. The extraction was complete. All that remained was a broken, heavily medicated man staring at a concrete wall, serving time for the very madness the industry had paid him to acquire. The federal prison system did not rehabilitate Riddick Bowe. It merely warehoused him, while the final stages of his financial liquidation were executed on the outside. When Bowe was released in 2004, he walked out of his cell and into an absolute economic void. The millions of dollars generated from his undisputed championship reign were gone, legally siphoned off by his former management and scattered across untraceable accounts. But the Internal Revenue Service does not care about predatory management, and it certainly does not grant clemency for brain damage. In 2005, Riddick Bowe officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The public documents laid bare the horrific efficiency of the boxing cartel's extraction process. Bowe had generated an estimated $50 million in gross fight purses over the course of his professional career. Yet, less than a decade after his last significant bout, he could not meet basic living expenses. The IRS, acting on the gross tax liabilities that Rock Newman had shifted entirely onto the fighter, systematically seized whatever residual assets Bowe had left. The government repossessed the properties. They drained the remaining accounts. The man who bled for the networks and the casinos was stripped down to the studs. He was officially classified as broke, permanently brain damaged, and unemployable in any conventional sector. The boxing industry ignores its casualties, but it never turns down a cheap novelty act. By 2013, a deeply desperate 45-year-old Riddick Bowe needed capital simply to survive. He was severely overweight, his speech was heavily slurred, and his reflexes were non-existent. In a grotesque display of exploitation, foreign promoters convinced the former undisputed heavyweight champion of the world to fly to Pattaya, Thailand, to compete in a professional Muay Thai kickboxing match. The venue was not Madison Square Garden or the Las Vegas Strip. It was a grim, open-air arena functioning as a localized casino for tourists and gamblers. Bowe stepped onto the canvas weighing well over 300 pounds. He wore customized shorts, a pathetic echo of his championship days. His opponent was Levgin Golovin, a Russian fighter who understood exactly what the assignment was. The fight was a sanctioned execution. Bowe had no understanding of Muay Thai mechanics. His deteriorated neurology could not process the incoming strikes. He stood flat-footed, a massive stationary target. Golovin did not even aim for the head. He targeted Bowe's legs. In the second round, after absorbing 5 uncontested brutal kicks to his shins and thighs, the structural integrity of Bowe's legs simply gave out. He crashed to the canvas. He could not stand up. He grabbed the ropes, grimacing in pain, entirely stripped of his dignity, while the crowd cheered for the knockout. It was a sickening, humiliating spectacle. The promoters paid him his meager purse, packed up the broadcast, and sent a broken man back to America. They squeezed out the absolute final drop of his commercial value, utilizing his famous name to sell tickets to a localized slaughter. 2 years later, the establishment that facilitated this destruction decided to launder its own conscience. In 2015, Riddick Bowe was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame in Canastota, New York. The ceremony was a masterclass in institutional hypocrisy. The same promoters who forced him into back-to-back wars with Andrew Golota sat in the audience. The same journalists who mocked his physical decline and branded him a criminal thug now stood up and applauded his legacy. They handed him a bronze plaque and a ring. They took photographs for the archives. But when Bowe stepped up to the microphone, the reality of the industry's toll was broadcast to the world. His speech was a slow, mechanical struggle. He stumbled over basic words. The neurological decay was the loudest presence in the room. The establishment was not honoring a living legend. They were pinning a medal on a ghost. The story of Riddick Bowe is not a sports tragedy. It is a highly successful, fully operational case study in corporate extraction. The American boxing cartel of the 1990s operated as a ruthless, unregulated machine. It required raw material to function. It found that material in Brownsville, Brooklyn, in the form of a heavily traumatized, physically gifted orphan who used his fists as a survival mechanism. The system identified his value and systematically stripped him of his defenses. It deployed predatory management to isolate him from his family. It utilized heavily biased, racially motivated media narratives to criminalize his public image, ensuring that the public would pay millions to see him get hit. It structured his contracts to guarantee that the men in suits took the cash while the fighter took the tax debt. And when his brain could no longer withstand the concussive force required to generate those millions, the system discarded him, leaving him to navigate federal prison, bankruptcy, and severe psychosis entirely alone. Riddick Bowe did not fail the sport of boxing. The sport operated exactly as it was designed to. It manufactured a god, extracted his blood, liquidated his future, and left nothing behind but an empty, echoing shell. The house always wins.